Kia ora. Kia ora everybody. Welcome to tonight's event. I'd just like to start the proceedings with an opening karakia. Whakatakata taho ki te uru. Whakatakata taho ki te tonga. Kia mā kina ki uta. Kia mā taratara ki tai. E hi aki ana te atakura. He hio, he huka, he hohu, ti he maureora. Good evening everybody. My name's Paul Kleinick. I'm the Acting General Manager of Engineering and Technical Services. I can. It essentially means, the question there was, can we translate the opening karakia? It's an opening which talks about ceasing the winds from the east, ceasing the winds from the north, reflecting on the opening of a new day, calming your mind and being present in the situation or for the opening meeting, and moving forward together. Evening, my name's Paul Kleinick. I'm the Acting General Manager of Engineering and Technical Services for Auckland Council. I'm the sponsor for the Coastal Management Program, or Coastal Management Plan Program, and also the MC for this evening. Just some housekeeping for tonight. As with the other presentations, your toilets are just out through the door from where you came. And in the event of an emergency, we'll follow the directions of the RSA staff. So they'll come through and direct us back out into the car park area from where you came in through the front doors. A reminder for tonight's session that it is being live streamed and it is being recorded. Those that are online this evening can ask questions via the email address that's at the bottom of each of our presentation slides. And these questions will be directed through to the correct staff in Auckland Council over the coming days, so we can reply back. The format for this evening, much with the other presentations, is in the top right-hand corner of the slide. We'll be speaking for roughly an hour before we move over to questions and answers from those in the room. Just a bit of a reminder as well that we do, although this is presentation 3, there is also a public open day this Saturday from 10 to 2 p.m. in the Whangaparāoa Library. So it'd be great to see anyone that's online or those in the room have the ability to come along. We're going to have a range of technical experts, council staff, and members from Tonkin and Taylor there to liaise with you. So on that note, I'd like to get us underway, and I'll pass us over to Council's project team to introduce themselves, those that are presenting this tonight, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Richard Rynan-Hamill from Tonkin and Taylor. I'm a coastal hazard expert supporting the Auckland Council team. A lot of experience in Whangaparāoa. It's a place I've been spending time with since the mid-90s, working with the council on a range of beaches, and I guess it's a place where I also paddle surf and really enjoy the environment.
Hi everybody, I'm Tracy Howe. I'm a coastal hazard specialist with Council, and I lead the coastal management project and work with Paul.
Hi everyone, my name's Jeff Lyford. I'm one of the Parks and Places specialists with Auckland Council. I've been working in the Rodney and Hibiscus and Bays area for the last 8 years, and I've been involved in a lot of coastal development projects and a lot of open space management around the parks and beaches that we all enjoy.
Hi, I'm Matt Rivers. I'm a coastal engineer with Auckland Council, and I help to manage the coastal flooding risk and coastal erosion risk around Auckland, and also manage some of the council's coastal assets.
Kia ora koutou. My name's Nancy Baines and I work for the Healthy Waters Department in Auckland Council, and I'm a rainwater or stormwater flooding specialist.
Thanks everybody. So just as we kick off this presentation, I wanted to remind you, and for those of you who are online, that we've taken a bit of a staged approach with this project where we build information. So what you're going to be seeing today, we'll be talking to you about adaptation strategies and options and what they look like in practice. If you want more information, we will provide an overview of what we talked about in the last 2 presentations. But if you want more information about coastal management planning or coastal hazards, please watch the first two presentations, which are available on the Council YouTube page. All right, so starting in on that overview, what are coastal management plans? Essentially, they're long-term, and long-term means 100-year long. And the reason that we do a 100-year time period is because that's some of our statutory requirements under the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement. Now, it's not just for legislative reasons that we choose that time period, it's also that some of the decisions that we make now will have effects for much longer time periods. And so we need to consider that framework. We need to consider how what we're doing now is going to impact us in the future. So these plans are adaptive. That means that they allow us to change our strategies as things change. And they take into account the impacts of coastal hazards and climate change. And of course, with climate change, things are evolving. And what we are doing in some of the aspects about carbon may impact what is going to happen and our ability to adapt to that. These plans also take into account the values of the local community, and we'll be talking to you about that more as we go through this process. Coastal management plans are co-designed with Manawhanaua, and we're working that through with them. Now, in terms of coastal hazards, what are we talking about? We're talking about coastal erosion, which is the wearing away of land from coastal processes, coastal inundation, which is the flooding of low-lying coastal land from the sea due to storm events, rainfall flooding, which is inland flooding, and the impacts of climate change. Now, why are we doing a pilot, and why are we doing that in Whangaparāoa? Well, you can imagine that given the variety of hazards we're talking about and the fact that we're talking about quite a lot of areas, it's a complex process. So we need to trial the process to make sure that we're getting it right. Once we've done that, we'll be scaling up to do coastal management plans across the Auckland coastline. Now, we chose Whangaparāoa in particular because it was identified as a hotspot in the coastal management framework, which was adopted by Council in 2017, but also because it has a really great mix of beaches and cliffs, of different coastal processes, a variety of council-owned land and assets, and it has also really strong and established communities. Now, that's you guys. And this is actually, as you'll see, a really important part of these adaptive plans. We cannot build adaptive plans without understanding how the community values and uses the space. They just wouldn't make sense. The local communities are going to live on the coast far longer than any particular asset, which is why these plans are not actually asset focused, they're focused on values. And we'll go through again what that means as we go through this process. One second, there we go. So what are we actually talking about? We're talking about coastal council-owned land and assets. We're talking about your public spaces. So this is your parks, your reserves, your public beaches. And we're talking about the council assets, which are your seawalls, your revetments, and also the more day-to-day things that you interact with, such as your wharves, your beaches, or your boat ramps, and your coastal stairways. On top of this, we're also talking about parks assets, which includes things like benches, toilet blocks, playgrounds, and other things. And now I'm going to pass you over to our park specialist to talk more about what we're actually talking about when we're talking about how you value the coast.
Okay, thank you. I've touched on this before in other presentations, but I thought today that I'd just try and spend a little bit more time on what we're talking about here. As Tracy touched on, it's not so much a plan that's focusing on the assets that are there now or what's there now, but developing how we're going to respond to changes over the next 100 years. And that key point of the community in a lot of ways and the values that they hold are more constant than some of the physical things that we see in those spaces. And the other thing that's really important to focus on is that a lot of the assets that council has in these spaces are there for people to use, for people to enhance or enable people to connect with the space, spend time in that space and to use it. So what we really want to understand is how do you value the coast, and what we mean by that is the experience that you get from it. Why do you live in Whangaparāoa? You know, there's fundamental things about the space and these places that draw you to them. There's activities that you go there to enjoy, and it might be as simple as walking along the beach to get a coffee in the morning. But if we don't understand, or we can't get an understanding of why people are doing those activities and what you're going there for, we can't extrapolate that into a long-term plan of what assets, what services council needs to provide in those spaces in the long term. Because the risk you run there is that the assets are only there for the assets for the sake of it. So you have a seawall that's just there because there's always been a seawall there, but we need to understand what the people, what the community do in that space, why they value that space, what they want to see there, so we can work with you to make good decisions about how to manage that space in the long term. So we've asked, how do you value the coast? And that could be heritage. You know, you've lived here for a long time, your family's lived here for a long time, you've got a deep connection to the space. That's important to us. That could be around family, that you go and visit, you picnic in a certain location, you visit there with your family, you spend leisure time, whether that's sport or relaxation, exercise. It's where you go to get your daily exercise fix, which helps with state of mind and all sorts of things like that. All of those activities and the way you use those spaces, to me, inform how we need to manage that space. And traditionally, council hasn't really asked these questions. We've assumed, it seems like common sense, that everyone knows what's good about a beach. But when something's under pressure and things are changing, it's those values and those experiences that a community value that we want to continue to be able to provide. We don't provide assets for the sake of assets. We provide assets to protect or to enhance or enable experiences and values of the community. So how are we asking you for this? How to get involved. So the first way, and a really valuable tool, is Social Pinpoint. It's a website. We've talked about this at previous presentations. It's getting quite a lot of use, but it could always use more. So please do share it if you've already used it. It enables people to drop pins showing why and explaining why you visit a location or why you value a location. And I encourage you to think about those questions in the context of what I've been trying to describe. What makes the place attractive to you? What is it that you go there to do? Because if we understand that, it helps this plan protect that into the future. We have the community reference group, which I know some of you here tonight are already part of, but this is a focused group where we're going to spend a lot of time with going into the detail, location-based, and starting to develop drafts of these adaptive pathways with you. So this is another opportunity for the community to really contribute that local knowledge, the experience and the values that are important to you in these places. So yes, that's what that is. And then finally, we've got an open day this Saturday where we'll give people an opportunity, just the general public, to stop in and again share their values, their experiences, and those things that draw them to these places with us. So why are the community values important? I've touched on this already. And these, by the way, are real comments that are coming through from Social Pinpoint. So these are things that the community have already really said about these places. When you read them, so lovely beach with accessible parking, that seems common sense, it seems really quite benign, but when you're looking at it from a long-term management plan, accessible parking stands out to me. We have a lot of places that aren't very accessible for people, that are difficult to get to, car parks that are difficult to move around on. That's to do with the topography. Great to be able to walk around the headland at low tide, so that could potentially change over time with sea level rise. How do we continue to provide that type of experience? We need proper walkways. What do we need to do to continue to provide those experiences? So rather than just getting an answer that says we need a seawall or we need a path, we get real information about what the community is doing, what they're enjoying, what experiences they value, and that allows us to explore a range of options to deliver those outcomes in the long term. It's not binding us to the assets we've got or specific outcomes. It's enabling us to have constructive discussions about how we deliver in the long term those experiences that community value. And so Tracy's going to talk a little bit about objectives, which is the flow on from identifying these values.
Thanks, Jeff. For those of you in the room, if you want more information about Social Pinpoint, we do have flyers that include the link to our page where it's available and a QR code which you can scan, which will take you directly to the website. Right, so objectives. So essentially, coastal management planning has a lot of different aspects that have to be pulled together. So we have the coastal processes, we have the coastal hazards, we have the infrastructure that is in these areas, we have the community values, we have a lot of different interests that we need to kind of pull together and understand how those things fit, basically like a puzzle. So how can we make all these things work to get a full picture? And the way that we do that is by outlining what our high-level objectives are. So some examples of potential objectives are things like we want to make sure the local community remains intact and able to access and use the coast. Another one might be that we reduce exposure to hazards where possible. And another one could be reduce flooding where possible. So if these are our objectives, they help us basically put together an understanding of what we need to do to make sure that we meet these goals. Now the CMP objectives will vary by area, and they will have to be worked through with the technical experts who understand the hazards and the impacts of climate change, the infrastructure providers who have the infrastructure in that space, Mana Whenua, and of course the community reference group. So if you're interested in helping us really get into the pulling together these adaptive strategies and understanding these objectives, please do join the community reference group. We do still have spaces available.
How do you do that?
Join the reference group? Yep, so we have the email at the bottom of the web, not this particular slide, but our email, which is coastalmanagementplans@aucklandcouncil.gov.nz. If you send us an email saying you're interested, we will get back to you with the application form. However, our community engagement consultant, Raquel is just back there. She'll be here afterwards, and you can speak to her as well, and she'll take your information. Okay, so this is a bit of an example. We're calling it Aucklandville Hazard Park. But I'm going to go over the hazards. These are the things that we talked about in presentation 2, so a few of you have seen them, but just going over what are we actually looking at in terms of the issues we're responding to with these adaptive plans. We're looking at coastal erosion, which is that wearing away of land. And this is, in this example, that yellow area is indicating the area exposed to that particular hazard. Now, coastal erosion is a long process. It can happen quite quickly due to storm events, but the actual wearing away of the coast does take time, and so that exposure zone may be that 100-year time frame. One of the other hazards we're looking at is coastal inundation, which is the flooding of low-lying land due to seawater during storm events in particular. And this may be the area exposed to coastal inundation. You'll notice that the zone exposed go further inland than coastal erosion, but one of the things about coastal inundation is that it's most likely to occur with major storm events, which don't happen regularly. So you have what you might have heard of as 1 in 100-year storm events, which are large peak events, and they can happen more often or less often, but they happen fairly infrequently. The frequency of these events may increase due to climate change, and that's one of the things we have to consider when we're looking at the risk in a certain space. One of the other hazards we're looking at is rainfall flooding, which is when you get rainfall that overwhelms the drainage capacity of an area. And again, the extent of this hazard can go quite far inland and all the way out to the coast. All of these hazards are going to have escalation because of climate change, and that's one of the reasons we're actually doing this planning process. Now, when we map all these hazards, what that does is that allows us to look at the type and the scale of the impact. And when we see that, we can start to look at areas that are high risk. Now what that means is that there's quite a lot of potentially assets or communities within the hazard zones that we need to look after and make plans for. And so in this particular example, you can see that this area has a much higher impact than that lower impact area. There are more things exposed to hazards than there are in that lower impact area. And in terms of what does that mean, when we identify areas that have higher impact versus lower impact, it actually starts to show us there's parts of the coast where we don't necessarily need to take much approach, in that essentially there are areas of the coast where we can allow nature to just continue its natural course. And so for large parts of Auckland, you're actually going to find that the strategy of no active intervention is a preferred response. And so we will just allow nature to continue. In other areas where you have high exposure, so you have lots of hazards and also lots of at-risk land and assets, and also places that the community values, those are areas that we really need to look at adapting and planning for. And so now to talk about the adaptation strategies and what they are, I'm going to pass you over to Richard.
Thanks, Tracy. Now, I guess one of the things we've been talking about, values, including community values. The environment obviously has a value too, and a lot of council parks and reserves have areas of significant value, both ecological and for the carrying capacities, the birds roosting and things like that. So all of the values need to be thought about in identifying what the particular area's values are, and some of that will be response from the community, such as yourself, but some of it will be from council experts and what's in the unitary plan. When we talk about adaptation strategies, at a high level, there's sort of 4 key policy directions that we'll be looking at. And Tracy's talked about the no active intervention, and that's effectively allowing nature to take its course. This is recognising that erosion's a natural process. The change of shorelines will happen over time, and it happened over thousands of years and will continue to do so. Allowing nature to take its course is a very useful thing for things like providing sediment from cliff erosion to help feed the beaches, to allow natural change to occur. So that process, if we put that with a climate change lens on, will mean that we're going to get whatever the processes are now, and those processes may change as a result of sea level rise. But within the council-owned land and the council-owned asset and infrastructure area that we're looking at, a decision we made that we'll just allow that to happen and to run its course. Moving across the page, I guess the opposite of that approach is holding the line. Holding the line is where we make a decision to fix the coastline or the land boundary at a particular point and protect that land from either ongoing erosion or from flooding. Historically, that's involved construction work, building of seawalls and revetments and the like, to protect that land area behind those walls. Those walls don't protect the beach in front of it, they don't protect the environment or the ecosystem under it, but it fixes the coast. I guess what we're looking at more recently is using natural and nature-based systems, enhancing the existing shorelines to provide a more natural system that gives us ecosystem benefits as well. So there's a range of different ways to hold the line that's been considered now. And moving down the page, we get to limited intervention. So this is considered, I guess, a light touch to assist the coastline where it needs some kind of encouragement. And this could be things like stormwater management, it could be sand transfer push-up, it could be vegetation enhancement and augmentation in area. So where an existing dune needs a bit of a boost, there could be fencing, some additional planting or augmentation. It could be managing access along those dune systems. So those can be really effective, small scale but useful measures that can improve that ecosystem benefit and that naturally functioning coastal edge that will assist in reducing erosion. With the dune increasing, that can also reduce overtopping issues and flooding. The last general policy direction is manage retreat. And this is effectively in areas where there is going to be significant change with climate and sea level rise and erosion, is moving assets landward so they're out of the way of the hazard. So it's accepting that nature is going to happen, but giving it space to do that, and providing the infrastructure and the assets at a location where it's not going to be as impacted. So a lot of the interest, I guess, from what we do at the coast is through understanding of coastal processes and applying those understanding of coastal processes into coastal engineering. So, and looking at this, it's traditionally the hard protection systems are in place, and I've talked about the natural and nature-based systems, and both have advantages, and both also have some disadvantages in terms of the hard protection. Those engineered structures can often cause changes to the natural processes. They can cause effects to how the sea and the tides and the movement of sand function. And they are only designed for a certain design life, so a certain period of time without maintenance and modifications, and they're only designed for a certain event. I'm sure you've seen the Japanese tsunami flood a decade ago now, that all of those tsunami flood protections were designed for a particular event, and they got a bigger one. And all of the flooding went over all of those flood protection events and caused lots of damage. So seawalls designed for a certain life and a certain event, when those are exceeded, those structures can fail and repairs can be costly. With nature-based solutions, it's looking at creating a more dynamic and adaptive natural functioning system. And again, that's working with nature to support the system that exists. So with dune enhancement and planting, that can provide some storage of sand that acts as a buffer for storm erosion. Often those nature-based solutions require more space, so you have to ensure that you've got the space for allowing those systems to take place. So when we look at these strategies and where nature-based and where hard structures or holding the line kind of things occur, nature-based solutions can basically occur across that whole spectrum of limited intervention, manage, retreat, and hold the line. When we look at hard structures, most of that is really to do with manage, retreat, in terms of removing and changing assets, or hold the line. In terms of the limited intervention, that's where decisions can be made to maintain and enhance existing seawalls and structures that are currently in place and have a function. When we look at, I guess, the cost, and cost is going to be an important part of the consideration in terms of the asset cost. No active intervention is a low cost for council in their parks and reserves and services. As we move to limited intervention, manage, retreat, and hold the line, those costs increase in terms of both capital and maintenance costs. Now I'm just going to pass on to Matt, and he's going to take you through a little bit more detail on some of these options.
Thanks, Richard. So I was just going to talk through some of the most common coastal defences. I won't cover everything, but just some of the ones that you most see most regularly around Auckland and New Zealand. So as Richard mentioned, coastal defences can broadly be split into those that are sort of nature-based options or those that are hard options, and then also the sort of in-betweens that we'll call hybrids. Now, of the hard options, the most common tend to be the seawalls and the revetments. So seawalls are vertical structures. They tend to be constructed of timber or concrete or masonry. And their real advantage is when you have very limited space and a significant height difference. Revetments, on the other hand, they're sloped structures, and they tend to be sort of rock or concrete. But both revetments and seawalls around Auckland are generally used to protect the land behind them from coastal erosion. So to a lesser extent, they do provide some flood protection from waves, but it's primarily coastal erosion protection they're providing. The future challenge will be that with over a metre of sea level rise, that in some cases the sea level will become above our land level for some of our parks and reserves. And so it is possible to construct hard defences to keep out the sea, but these would have to be impermeable, and they have all sorts of other challenges associated with them. So, for example, if you tried to hold out a sea level above the land level, then you'd end up creating a freshwater flooding issue because your fresh water would not drain until it is above your seawater. So you'd end up having a freshwater flooding problem where you used to have a coastal flooding problem. As well as that, you kind of risk having extra consequence to any failures. So if there was a more extreme event than your wall, you've now got a much more raised sea level that's significantly above the land level. And on top of that, you get issues on the seaward side of a hard defence through a process called coastal squeeze that I'll cover in a bit more detail now. So as sea levels rise, beaches want to migrate landward naturally. But coastal squeeze occurs when you have fixed defences, so where you have sort of hard defences forming a fixed boundary on one side, and then where you have the sea forming a boundary on the other. Now, as the sea levels rise, they tend to start reducing your dry high tide beach, if you were lucky to have some in the first place. And once the sea level reaches the toe of the sea defence, once your high tides are reaching that, then you're starting to lose your intertidal or your low tide beach space. Now, a similar process occurs with really valuable intertidal habitats, so things like your seagrass, your salt marshes, and your mangroves. So these have very niche areas of the tidal range that they live in, and so as sea levels rise, they would want to move landward up to the higher ground. But again, where you have a fixed boundary, that can result in them being squeezed out and then losing some of the benefits that they bring. And so that's just one of the reasons why you might look at considering more nature-based options to your coastal defences. So nature-based options, they look to try and support nature to strengthen its natural defences from coastal hazards. So for example, with the planting of sand dunes, by planting the sand dunes, the root systems help to stabilise the sand, and that helps to stop the coastal erosion occurring. On top of that, the plants help to capture sand, and that helps to raise the dune height, and that also reduces the coastal flooding issue. Similarly, with salt marshes and mangroves, you get they also stabilise sediment, they also build up the bed level, and they also help to dissipate wave energy. And they also bring all sorts of wider environmental and ecological benefits. The challenge with these natural options is that they do suffer some sort of natural variation, and they do suffer damage from storm events. So after a storm event, you would expect that it might be some recession and damage from those, but they also have the advantage of recovering over time. The key to having a really healthy natural buffer is to give them as much space as possible. So the larger the space you give them, the more buffer they have to experience damage and then to recover from that. And that's why we might look at, consider moving some of our council assets back from the coast in order to give more space. So moving, say, our toilet blocks and car parking just a little bit further landward. Another example where we might try and replicate natural processes is with beach renourishment. So beach renourishment is looking at adding sand to the beaches. And this helps to counter any coastal erosion, and it also helps to dissipate wave energy by having a larger beach, as well as bringing amenity value from your beach. So in this example in the sketch, you might have sand transport moving from wind and waves, taking your sand along the beach. Now, if we get to a point where we decide we can't lose any more sand from that end where it's being lost, then we might decide to carry out a sand transfer and move some of that sand from where it's being built up back to where it's being lost. But around Auckland, this is mostly just being done on quite a local scale, so just from one end of the beach to the other. So this tends to be quite a short-term response. It tends to need to be repeated quite regularly. Internationally, there's a lot more examples where sediment is brought in from much further offshore in much larger quantities. And the benefit of that is that it is adding sediment to the system as a whole, and so that helps to have a longer lasting impact. Now, The key thing with those is to make sure that you're sourcing your sediment from a appropriate supply. Now with the renourishment, you haven't affected the coastal processes, so the erosion would still continue over time and you would still have the sediment transport. So what we do with hybrid options is we look at combining hard options to support the nature-based options. So using, say, things like groins, we can interrupt the sediment transport and we can keep a more stable beach. So here at Torpedo Bay, we added rock groins and carried out some beach renourishment to create a larger, more stable beach. Similarly, you can use things like offshore breakwaters. So these reduce the wave energy and get some extra sediment deposited, and that helps to build out the beach. And breakwaters, this one's from Norfolk in the UK, but you get a lot more examples of various shapes and sizes breakwaters. They can be different construction materials, and they tend to, they can also be submerged and act like reefs. But the key thing really is to make sure you're designing them carefully, making sure they're appropriate for the site, and making sure you're not causing any knock-on effects or erosion to the adjacent areas. So I think that's all from mine, but I'll now pass on to Nancy for some stormwater infrastructure.
So, as with the coastal options that Matt and Richard talked about, for the water that comes from storms or stormwater, there are also these hard and nature-based options, and they have their advantages and disadvantages as well. An example of the hard or engineered option would be stormwater pipes. So you probably see these quite frequently. And some options of nature-based solutions might be daylighting, wetlands, and stormwater ponds. So daylighting is when a historically buried stream is returned to a natural open stream. And this has multiple benefits. Firstly, the water is flowing more naturally and the habitats on the stream banks can slowly return back to a more natural state. This is also often open streams are more resilient to flooding than stormwater pipes because water can enter from all directions directly into the stream rather than solely from a pipe inlet. And yeah, so there are some disadvantages to this. That a stream does need more space than a pipe, and it often can need other infrastructure such as bridges as well. You can also see here in this diagram that the stream is going across the beach, and this will change how people use the beach. Some other examples are wetlands and stormwater ponds. So here we have Stanwell Reserve, so some of you may be familiar with it. And this is it in 2004. So the stream that's going from the bottom of the picture to the top is a tidal stream, so it's being flushed twice daily by the tides. In 2008, a stormwater pond and wetland were created parallel to this stream. So this works by the water coming into the top of the wetlands and then slowly working its way through the pond system before rejoining the stream at the end. This has multiple benefits again, because this slow movement of water allows pollutants to settle out, and this improves the water quality. It's also good for peak flow flooding downstream, so when there's a storm, the water can quickly enter into the wetlands, take its time, and then leave slowly at the other end, reducing those peak flows downstream. It's also a nice habitat for both aquatic and bird life. This is actually a fish resting area, and it's a nice place for people to use. This has got paths through it. It's also got a cycleway up to the local school, which is making access for students much easier. So next time you're in the area, well, go and have a look for these features and see them for yourselves. Yeah. I'm going to pass back to Tracy now.
Thanks, Nancy. All right, so you've heard quite a lot of information. You've heard about coastal engineering, adaptive strategies, community values, adapting infrastructure, and now what we're going to do is we're actually going to pull it all together through our example. All right, so looking at Hazard Park, Aucklandville, we're going to talk about that area, which we know is exposed to hazard, but just going through the hazards again, talking about coastal erosion, flooding from the sea, which is inundation, and rainfall flooding as well. And as we talked about earlier, this is the area where everything is exposed that we need to look at adapting. So what does that mean? Well, it means we need to consider a variety of things. So what we need to consider is first, what are the magnitude and likelihood of these hazards? If these hazards are small and they don't happen very often, we may not need to do much. If they're large and they happen quite a lot, we may need to do quite a lot. We need to look at how important is the infrastructure in that area, how does the community value that space, and also when do we need to adapt this? So what are the time frames we're looking at with all of this? And basically we pull all that information together to develop our strategies and our options. But going through this question of when do we need to adapt? Well, adaptive planning allows us to change based on what is happening. So it's not actually you pinpoint a time in the future and say at this stage we'll do this. What it is that we actually go through a process of understanding how the risks might change. So if you look at this area right now, we could say actually that it's okay. The risk of this is acceptable, that not too much is going on, and when we have a period of time like that, we basically say, well, it's doing okay. We don't need to do too much. So for right now, in the short term, no active intervention will be our strategy. But over time, we know that the risk is going to increase. Some of these hazards are going to happen more often, and eventually we're going to reach a point, which we'll call a trigger, where the risk is no longer acceptable. So in the short term of this example, at some stage the edge of this car park is eroding. That may be in 5 years during a storm event, it may be in 20 years. But essentially, when the edge of that car park starts to erode, that's our trigger. And we know when we hit our trigger that we need to change strategies. So in this case, we choose to go to a strategy of limited intervention. And we do things like dune planting, to support the natural buffer so that there's a bit of space for the erosion to occur if it needs to, and to help the beach recover. We may also do some beach nourishment, again, to help with that natural buffering. But at some point in the future, we might hit another trigger. So in the medium term, which again, in the medium term could be anywhere between 20 to 60 years in the future, the car park and the stormwater pipe, in this example, may begin to get regularly damaged. And at that stage, we've hit this other trigger point and we need to change strategies again. And so at that stage, we would actually choose probably to move these assets back out of the hazard zone. So we would change our strategy to manage retreat. Now, how does this intersect with community values? So going through those comments that Jeff looked at earlier, which again, these came directly from Social Pinpoint, we've gotten an idea of some of the things the community cares about. So in this example, this person has said they really care about the space to kick the ball around and to use. So they care a lot about that rugby field. So we know from that recreational space is really important. This other comment that beach parking and accessibility of the coast is key tells us that access and parking are really important. These comments, which are about being able to walk and run on the beach and go around the headland, tell us that beach areas are extremely important. And also this final comment where she says, I need to go up here to walk and experience the views, it's really calming, tells us that the viewpoints are very important. Now this information that we've gathered from the community, how do we actually incorporate that into what we're doing? Well, this is our example again. So going back to that idea of objectives, these are the high-level objectives that we want to meet. We want to reduce our exposure to hazard zones. We want to reduce the flooding where possible. And we want to incorporate those community values so that the community can stay intact and access the coast. So for this example, moving out of the hazard zone means we probably have to move that car park and that bench out of the erosion zone. So we move those back. Reducing the flooding means that we probably are going to daylight that stream to give more space for the natural processes of water to flow. So we daylight that stream. And then if we look at these values, what we do is we reconnect those access ways. And what you can see is we no longer have assets in the erosion zone. So we've retreated them out of the hazard zone, but the community still has really great access to the recreation space. They still have their accessibility and their parking. They still have a beach they can go to, and they can still get to those coastal viewpoints. We consider that a win, and we've met all of the objectives. Now, obviously, this is a relatively simple example, and some of the strategies and areas we're going to try to work with will be more complex, but always we're going to try to meet every objective that we can and to incorporate as many community values as we can, because the people who live here are the reason that we're doing this. Now, I'm going to pass you back to Richard to go over some case studies so we can actually look at some of these things.
Here in Auckland. This is Rhode Island in the States. It's just below the city of Boston on the Atlantic coast. What we can see on the screen here is the current sea level rise for a 100-year storm surge, so typically kind of the conditions that we look at for flooding here in New Zealand. What it shows is with your storm surge, you're going to get some low-level flooding around that coastal edge and extending sort of reasonably up some of these lanes and roads, particularly at that southern end. When you overlay sea level rise, so they use a 5 foot or around 1.5 metres of sea level rise, this island gets significantly inundated from both sides. So over the long term, it's got quite a significant issue. This particular study that they looked at, I guess, was what they called a limited intervention option. What they were doing and finding is, I'll just move back one. So a lot of the roads that extended out to the coast were requiring a lot of coastal protection and rock armour getting placed because they were suffering erosion, and the flooding and the inundation was coming up those roadways because they were graded down and getting low access to the coast. So what they decided to do was to retreat the road heads away from the coast to create a wider buffer or green zone between the sea and land. So that's your existing road heading out, sort of your boat ramps and access to water. By moving the road and the structure through that retreat process, they ended up with a grass space which they could shape slightly higher, stop some of that inundation coming through, and they're working through planting to augment that as well. So it's a retreat of some of, just not all of the coast, but enough of it to cause and create a green buffer that they could use to augment and minimise the flooding in the short term. So this, as Tracy was saying, would be one of those short-term options that they'd be looking at. The next study is here in Auckland. It's Hui Bay in Manukau. This is a project that we were involved with the council. What you can see in the top part of the screen is back in the 60s, a seawall was constructed to protect the reserve from erosion. There's sand, longshore drift and movement of sand away from the coast, and that caused undermining of the seawall. So when they built the seawall, the sands were halfway up the seawall. Through the erosion process, that sand moved away, exposing and undermining the wall. And what was happening with storms is waves were sucking out sand from the reserve itself underneath the wall and causing big cavities and holes behind the seawall. So significant problems for the reserve. The option decision was to try and use a nature-based solution of restoring the sand, but recognising and understanding the coastal processes. Putting sand back there would just allow that sand to be moved again and removed from the system. So there were some groins constructed perpendicular to the seawall, and some sand was taken from an area out in the bay, and some sand was imported to create a sandy beach that not only protected the reserve from erosion, but provided a much better amenity. And as you can see, for birds, as a bird roosting habitat, but also for the community. And there's a playground just here, so all the kids love it. They can no longer sort of drop off the wall onto the beach, but can actually walk down to the low tide. Another example of a hybrid approach is also in the Manukau. This is Pahurihuri Inlet. This was a reserve with a large stormwater infrastructure and wastewater network running through the reserve, so there was some critical infrastructure sitting there. The high tides were causing, and wave action causing erosion of the bank, and we were asked to look at this and develop a seawall option. Now, because it's a fairly shallow harbour environment and the wave energy was fairly low, the erosion process was caused by the high tides, low wave action, and the fact that the geology of this particular location was very poor. It was a Tauranga group rock, which when it got wet became like toothpaste, so very easily erodible. So the option we decided was we didn't really need to put a large rock revetment there. We had a look at some of the rushes that were already existing there and came up with a hybrid solution where we put a rock sill, so using less rock, smaller volume, to break the wave energy, and planted rushes, graded the bank back and planted that with marine vegetation that was resistant to wave run-up, to create a solution that recognised some of the values of the rushes and the ecosystem that was there, but gave it space and gave it protection to thrive. That's just a little bit of the detail there. So protected planting is a way of recognising what the coastal processes are for that particular environment and trying to develop solutions that help manage those particular effects rather than the default response of build a wall, where it takes more resource, it doesn't create the same ecosystem benefit. The last example I'm going to go through is probably one of the first managed retreat projects that the Auckland Council did. Car park at the southern end of Muriwai, a very popular spot, but getting hammered by storms, and there was very large-scale erosion at this particular location that happened over many years, and lots of discussions to build bigger and bigger seawalls and protect that car park. Decision was made to retreat the car park to allow the dunes and the natural functioning to have enough space for those cyclical erosion processes that were occurring. That was carried out in 2011, and the dunes here planted very well, some access provided, but what that has done is reduce cost. Council's no longer having to shore up and protect that car park and the erosion events that were occurring, creates an improved amenity and a habitat for the ecosystem. So these are all examples of both in Auckland and internationally where, by understanding the physical processes that are occurring and looking at a range of design solutions, you can try and tick those boxes of improving things for the environment and for public and amenity. I'm just going to pass back to Tracy and she'll close out and wrap this up.
Thanks, Richard. So I guess this is the stage where we talk about the process. Of course, we're in Whangaparāoa, but Whangaparāoa is only one part of the Auckland coastline, which is quite large. So we do have 3,200 kilometers of coast to manage. So what we'll be doing with this process is essentially going to each of the coastal cells over the next 3 to 5 years and putting together these strategies for every single one of them. And once we've done that and we have the whole picture, we'll be pulling together what we're calling our regional coastal asset management plan. And that's basically how we're going to prioritize funding, pull together what we can actually do and the timelines in which we can do it. Now, what's interesting about these plans is, of course, because they're adaptive, they're far-reaching plans, they're 100-year long, but most of the triggers that we are potentially looking at, we don't expect to happen in the short term. We're thinking that they're probably going to be happening about 10 years onwards. For things that are happening now, or in the near future, Council does still have its ongoing maintenance and renewal processes that it will be continuing while we do this regional understanding and planning process. Of course, all of the options that you've heard about, they cost money. And we have to think about that. There are things that Council, and actually Auckland as a region, can't afford. You know, we can't build a Thames barrier across the Waitemata Harbour, and I don't think we'd want to do that. But we have to think about what's best for the region and plan. And so we will be doing all of our coastal management plans before we actually implement any of these strategies. Now the pilot, so where are we at? So the pilot is set up, so we have these 3 public presentations which provide you guys an idea of what it is that we're trying to do and start to gather information about community values. This was our last public presentation, but we do have our open day on Saturday. We will be available after this for those of you in the room to come and ask us questions of anything you're interested in. But for those of you online or anyone you know who might be interested, all of us, all of the project team will be available to answer questions at the open day, which is on this Saturday at the Whangaparāoa Library from 10 to 2. Once we finish that open day, we go into the development of adaptive plans. Now we're doing this, as we said, with the community reference group. So the community reference group, what they're actually going to be helping us do is develop those objectives. So those high-level objectives that we're working towards meeting, they're going to help us develop those. They're also going to help us develop the strategies that we might put in place for different areas. And they're really going to help us understand the community values. So they're going to help us pull the information that we've heard from Social Pinpoint into something that makes sense. They're going to talk to us about what they know from their networks, their friends, their communities, so that we really encapsulate as much information as we can about how people use and access the space. Once we've gone through that process of developing these plans, we will have an open day again where we actually present the options to the public, where people can speak to us and provide some feedback. And once we've done that, we're going to go through the process of writing up an actual plan report, which will be available to the public to look at and to get an idea of what the strategies are. All of the CMPs will end up with a report that will be available to the public so that you guys can look at them and see how we're going. And yeah, looking forward to your questions. Thank you. Yeah.
I've just got a general question, that is, from what I've heard tonight, you people are starting off your planning from this decade, the beginning of it. Now, I've been on the peninsula for 60 years, and I can only think back to what I could see back at 60 years ago. And I'm very convinced I could say that not much has changed at all on almost all the beaches on the peninsula. There was the Stanwell Reserve, which was built out of mangrove, sure. So my question is, are you able to say that your work is going to be in context? And that is it going to start off with the rate of change over the last few decades at least, before you start getting into what's going to happen in the future?
Sorry. Yeah, I think that's it's an interesting question, because you're right. Quite a few of the beaches look as though they haven't changed, but actually quite a lot of Auckland's coast has been modified through some of these coastal engineering processes that we've been talking about. And Stanmore Bay is a really great example, because in 2018 there was a big storm event there that caused massive erosion. And actually the council team went in and dune planted up that beach in order to allow it to recover better. So a lot of the beaches that you see have actually had essentially some modification to keep them as they are. In terms of these plans, the reason that we do it to triggers and not to timelines is because you're right. So in that example where, we said the first trigger was where the car park started to erode, for example, if we never got to the stage where the car park started eroding, we would just leave that beach as it is, because we wouldn't need to do anything. So that's where the planning process really gets into that adaptivity, where it allows us to change based on what needs to occur when it occurs. So you're right, that the timeline of things may, climate change may be a huge influence and may start having a lot of problems in 10 years, 20 years, or it may not, and we may not have any issues for quite a long time period and we continue as we are. But having the plan in place allows us to have that forward thinking there, so that if something does happen, we know what to do.
Sorry, and just follow up from that. the hazard information of looking at change certainly goes back and looks at those historic photographs from the 50s and the 40s to try and map that change. And that's really important to understand the present day context and what's happened in the past. And then we project what may happen in the future to give us an idea what that potential consequences are. But adaptation plans, the real value is having a discussion on what options, what you would do when and if before you have that event occurring. And by having it on triggers, it means you don't race and spend and do money when you don't need to. So don't mess with the system if you don't need to, is a really good thing.
And yes, you're right that sea level rise so far has been very small to date, so not much has happened, but all projections show it accelerating into the future. So, and yeah, so as they've said, the point of using triggers is that if the projections are wrong, then we don't need to do anything.
Come to you next.
I'm wondering whether I'm addressing the right committee, because I was hoping to get some information on what's going to happen today or tomorrow, because I walk on Ariba Beach every morning. I've been here 10 years now, and I've watched it deteriorate. And the other day, the first tree fell into the tide because the roots were all washed away. And now the tree next to it is really big, is about to fall in, and that could go down on someone and create some injury or even worse. What I've found when I walked along and looked at all the damage that's been done, there's one particular area there where there was a 3 metre high rock wall, and that is as good today as it was 10 years ago. And I really can't understand why we can't put a rock wall through, because if you look at that rock wall, there's no tide going underneath it, and it certainly doesn't go over the top. So my suggestion is we need something doing it now. It frightens me when I look at 3 to 5 years and we're still looking at this, the banks just crumbling. It's getting worse and worse, and I was hoping tonight that someone would say, well, we're about to make a start on Ariba Beach, but obviously that's not going to happen. So I'm wondering whether I'm addressing the right committee, whether I should be somewhere else with some other committee that's working on this sort of thing.
So thank you. Very good question. I'll just move to the front. We are about to make a start on Auckland Beach, which is a good response to your question. Although Audi was not considered as part of this pilot, it falls more within what Tracy talked about in the general operations and maintenance work that Council's progressing. So some of you in the room might be aware of the Audi seawall application that went to the Environment Court, where consent was granted, which enables us to, for a certain section of Auckland Beach, around 640 metres, construct a seawall to provide some protection to the very little Esplanade Reserve that remains. For other parts of Auckland Beach, we're about to, and Jeff might want to talk to this as well, we're about to initiate some dialogue with the community about a range of management options for that area as well, in and around the surf club, and in and around Auckland Reserve, which is where you've noticed the scar that you're talking about. So separate to this process, but definitely quite a lot of work happening in that space. I would say to you, keep an eye on updates from Council over the coming months in respect to the Mayor's proposal around funding availability for whether we'll be able to kickstart the Auckland Seawall project again.
I'm not going to talk about the engineering or seawall stuff, because there's people here that know a lot more about that than me. But the comment there is really important to me around the seawall, and that's where the community values come back in, and some of what you've been hearing around coastal squeeze and things like that. Where we have the reserve and the surf club, that dry high tide sand beach, and access to the water for that kind of typical New Zealand beach day kind of activities is really, really important to the community, as I understand it. We want to capture that kind of information because if we were to choose a rock revetment, for example, all the way along in front of that bit of the beach, over time, this evidence suggests that we would lose more and more of the ability to provide that experience to the community. The coastal squeeze would mean we would lose dry high tide sand beach in front of the surf club, in front of Stanwell Reserve, if we were to build a hard structure all the way along there in the current position where the coast currently is. So that's a very, very poignant example of why the community values are really important, because we want to understand why that place is important, what you do there, how you do it, so these guys that are the experts in understanding the coastal systems, the options, can tell us how each option will affect your experience of that place and those values long term, to make sure we make the right decision. Because it sounds simple, but when I'm hoping after 3 of these sessions that as a group we're starting to get where we understand the complexity, that all of these engineering outcomes based on the coastal science are going to have different effects on how the community can enjoy and experience that place in the future. And we need to be making sure we're understanding what's valuable to the community and involving the community so we make the right decisions there. Because you know, a future that doesn't have dry, high tide sand beaches for a New Zealand beach day, that's a hard pill to swallow.
I think Jeff answered that very, very eloquently, so pass that to Paul.
To that man who was talking about 40 years, you hadn't seen any change? Is that what I got from your message?
60 years.
Well, you should have been on Big Manly Beach after that big storm came through and washed out all the grass, washed out the berm, took out all the pegs that they had planted there to keep people off the grass. And nature might not move quite fast enough for you, but I can tell you that climate change is on its way, and the next big storm that comes into one of these beaches will do just as much damage. And so open your eyes, walk around the beaches after the big storms, and you'll see enough change to make 60 years look like past and flash. Oh, sorry.
Just on the
I just wondered if you could elaborate a little bit more on the whole concept of the triggers. So it sounds like what you're saying is it's around impact on assets, but I'm just wondering, what about impacts on things where there's not an impact on an asset, but there might be an impact on a natural system or something like that? Is there a way that the trigger concept can incorporate that, where it's maybe not visible to the everyday person's eye that a car park's falling in, but there may be an impact on, you know, like spawning zones or a whole lot of natural processes and things like that?
So I think that's a really good question, and part of, I guess, Council's responsibility and remit is those natural environments that don't have a voice and can't be heard. So I think Matt talked about that coastal squeeze, how your natural systems with sea level rise can run out of space to migrate landward if they hit other barriers or that space isn't provided. So certainly part of this option and having input from Mana Whenua and the wider council is identifying those particular habitats and looking at the environmental things. So part of our vulnerability assessment looks at significant ecological areas, areas of regional and national significance as part of that evaluation. So considering those 4 well-beings is an important part of the process. I guess I'm just dialing back to the 40 and the 60 year and the storm discussion. Storms are a part of a natural process, and storms can take out beaches which can then recover over time. But the thing with sea level rise, and while we haven't had a lot of sea level rise, we have had some 17 centimetres over the last 100 years, which is actually Yeah, a reasonable amount. So when you get storms that are happening higher up the beach, more able to attack the dunes, and where I'm seeing the impact of that kind of sea level rise is actually in the harbour environments rather than on the open coast, because the open coast are a little bit more dynamic, there's more things coming and going, but in a place like the Manukau, where you've got a very weak cliff bank kind of edge, we're seeing much greater extents of erosion around the edges of mangroves and salt marsh, and it's a lot more evident in the harbours, but if it's happening in the harbours, it is also happening on the open coast, but there's more things going on that obscure it at the moment, but it is something that is happening.
You want to go first?
Yeah. I just wanted to say as well about the trigger question. Every single area that we look at that needs an adaptation strategy will have its own triggers, and they will vary. Some areas it may be an ecological trigger that we hit first, some it may be infrastructure, some it may be based on the values of the community and things that are happening. But understanding what the triggers for an area are is one of the key parts of actually those strategies. So those will be discussions we're having with the reference group as well.
Just by extending that, I guess, is what I was saying, as part of the adaptive strategy. In the do nothing, there may be monitoring in there. So do nothing is probably a bit blunt. It's more that we're not going to completely ignore something until the car park falls in. We're going to keep an eye on it to check when those triggers get hit. And like you say, there will be things, probably better to speak to me, but council does already run beach profile monitoring and things like that, as well as ecological monitoring and other things. So, do you want to talk about beach monitoring?
Well, yeah, we are monitoring beaches, but yes, monitoring will be included in probably most of these. And just in terms of triggers, there's going to be a full range of things we might consider. So in some areas, I suppose where it's low consequence, we might look at erosion up to a certain point, and then when erosion reaches that point, we then have to change strategy. It could be when flooding reaches a certain point, so where, say, an event starts occurring every year, or if a major event comes, and that might be when you want to do something. If it's a higher consequence type thing, then you might want to look at sort of measuring sea level rise so that you can proactively start your process of moving something that's really high consequence so that it doesn't suffer any flood if it can't afford to. And then it could also be things like looking at when our asset is going to reach the end of its residual life, and then that's a sensible time to also change strategy.
So how much does the coastal management plan work with the unitary plan? Can you have any impact on the existing unitary plan? Okay, I'll reference this because if there's potentially thousands of houses going into Gulf Harbour, which is going to affect the value of the coastal management assets, because you can't get parking, you can't actually enjoy the quality of life for people on Whangaparāoa. They cannot enjoy it if you can't get to the beach to park, to see it. So thousands of houses going into Gulf Harbour is going to have a massive impact. So what part do you guys play in working with the unitary plan or the town planners to affect change?
Actually, I'm going to pass to Tracy for this one, but I might add to it at the end.
Okay. It's a really good question. So the way that we're doing coastal management plans is, of course, we're looking at these individual areas, but as Richard mentioned, we have a vulnerability study, and that vulnerability study includes the forward projection of how many people are going to be in certain areas and what the escalating risk of having that many people in certain areas is.
Do you know how many people are going to be in Gulf Harbour?
A lot, I know. Yeah.
But do you have a number?
We do, but we don't have it. She doesn't have it with it.
You don't want to share it with us because you terrify people?
No, I personally don't have that number.
Oh, okay.
Yep, I would tell you if I did. But I think the consideration of how we provide for that is in the bylaws, and Jeff can speak to that. That we do have a certain amount of amenities that we have to provide per capita. So there will be, you know, increasing amounts of, I'm assuming parks. I'm not answering this properly. Let me back up and go to the unitary plan thing. The unitary plan was set in place almost a decade ago, and as part of its structure, it's actually meant to be reviewed. And so because the national government is going through the RMA reform right now, when that comes through, the unitary plan is going to be reviewed.
So you can have an influence.
Yes. Yes. And so the unitary plan, the process of reviewing that will take quite a while, but there will be changes that are going to be made over that as we go through that process. So what you're seeing happening now is not always what you're going to see happening in the future with some of these development decisions and stuff like that. Parks question I should probably pass to you if it was a question.
And I guess that, I mean, I'm hearing two issues. The first is where you put people and where you intensify development. The kind of work that the vulnerability assessment will be saying is where you don't do, where you shouldn't be putting people in terms of hazard areas. It doesn't mean that those people won't be there at a different location out of the hazard zone. So just being clear. Our work that we're currently doing is looking at informing on the hazards and looking at how the plans we do for council-owned land and assets and infrastructure. It's going to be help. All of this will help inform council and planners make decisions, but our remit at the moment is focused on that area only.
Which is sad. It's travesty. You imagine Whangaparāoa golf course filled with houses. The road cannot cope. It's going to have an impact on Matakitia Tyndall's Bay. That tiny little lane, the floodlands between those, that valley, it just can't cope. It's not going to cope. Sorry.
The road about cultural parks.
I think you're raising some really good points. And if you cast your mind back to presentation one, we had a little bit of a discussion there around balancing growth in Auckland. So Auckland's population, I think, is still growing by, I think it's 1,000 people a week, might be more. Looking at where it's best to provide for that growth, this piece of work will definitely help with that. And there's other work that supports the coastal management plans in behind the scenes. So in respect of understanding our hazards better, we've prepared a coastal erosion, regional erosion susceptibility study for Auckland, which is published and is available online. And that gives a better guide on areas potentially susceptible to erosion over the next 30, 50 and 100 years. That piece of work in its own right will influence the unitary plan and influence some of the updates to the unitary plan with respect to the hazard provisions and guide where we should be or shouldn't be enabling growth within the coastal environment. That's the coastal environment. You've raised another concern there though about growth generally throughout Auckland, and probably we're not the best people to speak completely to that, about how we're planning for that and how we're balancing for that.
I'm actually pretty much talking about Gulf Harbour and that valley between Matakitia and that, because I know that when accidents happen, and they happen reasonably regularly, that tens of thousands of people get cut off. They cannot get to their home, they can't get out away from their home, they are stuck. So if you're going to put another thousands of houses in there, it's just going, you're talking about quality of life, coastal management. This is our life, this is our home, so it's not improving it. Okay, comparison, Huia. Could you imagine if they put 10,000 houses in Huia, the fuss that they'd make, or 10,000 houses in Muriwai? They've allowed those places to retain their sense of charm or beachside communities. They're not doing that in Whangaparāoa. They're actually slamming us so that they've taken away any joy and satisfaction about enjoying our actual beach lifestyle. I'm not saying not have development, but I am saying have development with care.
Well done. Very good point.
It's not a question, it's a comment. I've been on lake plays for about 20 years. I've been in touch with been in touch with what a lot of people want in this area, and the joys that I have of living so close to so many magnificent beaches. My request is simply that when you come to analyse a possible beach which might need a deal to it, please tread softly, and I think you've got that philosophy of making sure that no change is made to that beach unless it really, really has to be done. I can only think in terms of, I'm not greenie, but I think green people, they like to see natural things. They don't want rock walls, they don't want stones everywhere. And I can only say, in terms of Stanwell Bay, that marram grass, somebody planted by the reserve, I just hope there's been no storm since it was planted, and I just hope when the storm does come, it's going to stay there or survive anyway, because that's a natural feature and it works, and there was erosion along that place before. So please, take it easy before you jump in too far and too deep.
We have got one small one that relates to what you're talking about.
So I live on Little Manly Beach, so that's a particular passion, so personal to me. That stormwater drain, we have the worst water. Every time there's a storm, we can't swim there. Middle of summer, we can't swim. That should be a priority.
We're actually lucky enough to have the catchment manager here for that, so I think he might have some comments.
Yes, Little Manly is a beautiful beach. I used to take my kids there, and there's this big, massive pipe in the middle of it that is an eyesore. It has in the past had pollution in it. It is something that needs attention. I also want to liaise with Water Care to make sure there's no other cross connections and things like that that happen in heavy storms. Yes, we certainly should put that on the priorities, because it is a beautiful beach. And incidentally, if you just step up the road from the water that comes through that pipe, originally went to Big Manly. The top of the Big Manly beach to the north went all the way back to Little Manly, and it was the top of the catchment was about 5 metres above just where the road is. So it went all the way down to the Manly beach, and then in the 60s or 70s somebody put a subdivision halfway down and blocked it off, and so that water that comes out of Little Manly is not the original water that should have come out there. So yes, I think that should have a second look at.
And can we have a wharf there as well? There used to be a wharf. Sorry. Am I pushing it?
I think just to add to that, that's the sort of feedback that we'd love to see on Social Pinpoint. So if you haven't already, if you can log in there, and put those values in, put those experiences in, join the community reference group, would be great. Perfect.
Cool. Can I just... quite a lot of what you talked about there was a bigger picture than parks, but in terms of growth and what we'd call provision to cater for growth and for existing communities, that is something that this is extra to my normal job, but in my normal job I work quite hard with the local boards looking at the provision of services like play and parking and the access to water, boat ramps and things like that, to try and make a case, I guess, to attract the various streams of funding that exist to support those things. So I didn't want to leave with the impression that parks isn't working to improve those services and cater for growth, but I'm quite aware that that's a small thing against the big picture of why that growth's happening and stuff. But we do work on that. So.
Because if it's not working right now, what I see, if it's not working right now, then when you put all these other thousands of homes in, it's just putting more and more pressure. Like the Gulf Harbour Oval, you can't, it's all dotted yellow lines, you can't actually park there. So how can you use the grounds if there's no car parking?
Yeah, so things like that are great to hear and put in, again, social pinpoint, but we actively work with the local boards to try and improve what is there, but also cater for growth. And when there are those high growth areas, there's opportunity to attract funding. And as parks, we're also working on getting better information about the visitors, similar to what we're discussing here. We haven't traditionally sort of known how many people use our parks, and when you compare that to, say, sports in Auckland, they've got their lovely ability to talk about playing hours and sports teams and numbers, and in the past that's enabled them to make strong cases for funding. We've noticed that, and we're working on getting that kind of data to support the use of reserves and recreation, so we can
Teenager, I can tell you.
make those cases to the people that make decisions about big scale funding that, hey, these coastal beaches and parks are suffering more use through growth and change of Auckland, and we need to invest more in them. So that's something we're actively working on. So, yeah.
I've been on the coast a very long time, and my children have grown up on the coast, and my grandchildren are also growing up on the coast. And this is a pilot scheme, and I'm wondering that if, being a pilot, we couldn't extend it from the mean high water tide out 50 metres or something, so we also include the water to which we're swimming in and the activities to which we use. They call themselves coasties, the kids who live on the coast, and part of it is the ocean. And at the moment, the coastal management plan is only going to the beach. I think it should go out further, and so the same through all of Auckland when you go to do the rest of them. Because the swimming is also part. When you go to the beach, you go to swim. So we need the quality of the water to come up. We then need, like you put in Apples Bay and Manly, those swimming things where they swim pontoons, and the wharfs where the kids go and fish off. And that's out in the water, but you're only going at the moment from what you told us last meeting up to the mean high water tide.
There's two things in there. I might just answer the non-technical part of it first. But okay. So the other guys will talk about what that actually means from the plan, but from a parks perspective, this is what that is about. This is the information we're asking for in terms of. We talk about beach access and parking and access to the water for recreation. All of those, a pontoon, a track down a cliff, a wharf, a jetty, a boat ramp, those things that extend out into the water, they're providing access to the water. They're providing those experiences. That's how they're enabling recreation. We want to hear about those, because those are the things that we're going to have to figure out how to maintain. They're expensive, there's lots of challenges with them, so if we don't hear from you about how you use them and how you value them, it's harder for us to make those cases to prioritise those things. So aside from the technicality of the plan, think about it as access to the water for recreation. We are definitely interested in that as part of this plan.
So I think I told you last time, which is that mean high water springs, and it is to do with council assets and land, which is above the mean high water springs. But the points you raise in terms of the values and the recreation things that people enjoy are the kind of values that Jeff here really wants to see on social pinpoints. So put a pinpoint in the offshore area and say why that's important to you and what those values are. And that will help inform the discussion. Now, from a land-based perspective, you'll be getting to that site from land, and you'll be wanting some space or some parking or some access provisions to enjoy that particular value or the function. So it will be considered, but at the moment this study doesn't extend beyond the mean high water springs. But Healthy Waters is working very hard and listening to discussions on water quality. That water quality comes from the catchment of the land, so that treatment needs to happen on the land. If it occurs, that will have a benefit into the coastal environment.
Yeah, so on that water quality note, you mentioned earlier that sometimes an animal you can't swim. As you were checking on Safe Swim for that.
Yep.
And there's another project that works alongside Safe Swim. So where there's especially the very frequent bad water quality that could risk people's health, there's another project called Safe Networks, and this is trying to locate where there's the pollution's coming from, and if there's those problems, tracking down whose responsibility it is to fix it as well. So work is being done in that area.
So you're going to be able to ascertain how to fix the drain into Little Manly Beach?
I can't personally speak for Little Manly. We can pop back to but to Ken and to the board here. But in general, across the region, that is the plan, to work through these areas that we see high pollution, try and work out why and how it can be fixed.
I don't know how long we've lived here, but
20 years.
Okay, so when Bowler came, the reserve in Sundown, the Sundown Reserve, that used to be all covered in trees. And when Bowler came, it flooded all the houses there. I live on one of those houses that's right here. And the council, Rodney District Council at the time, had to do something pretty urgent. And that is when we had an open drain running through there, and they put the pipe right through. But what really needs to happen now is in Sundown Reserve, where there's an open park, that needs to be taken out, all the concrete, and put into plants and things like that.
Like done in Stanwell Bay.
So that, like we've done at Stanwell Bay, the same thing needs to happen at Little Manly, because all the stuff that goes through that pipe comes from up at the top of Whangaparāoa Road, down into Rakino, down into Sundown, into the new subdivision, well, it's not new anymore, but the subdivision that it's the end of Sundown Avenue, and all the oil and stuff from cars that's on the road go through there. And when you go into that drain, I constantly ringing the council about it, because gravel goes down there and so does all the oil. So yes, there is, but one of the biggest problems is money. And it's not an easy fix, and it's not cheap to do. And that is why I still believe that is the reason why Little Manly is not being able to be swum in when we have rain, heavy rain. And when you talk about having a wharf down there, it's not cheap. And you know how...
I know, it was a nice ad.
Yeah, it's a nice idea. But we wanted to put a pontoon. We wanted to put a pontoon at Little Manly, but when they did the investigation, there was nothing to actually hook it onto that would be safe for people to be able to jump on. So that's why the pontoon didn't go at Little Manly, went down to Manly instead. So we do look at things and we try to do things as much as we can, and that's why this process is going to be so important, that everybody has their say and we can get a good picture for going forward. So thank you to everybody that has been coming to the meetings. It's really been helpful.
Thanks, Jenna. Any other questions?
In terms of the engineered solutions, is there any consideration to aesthetic? So it's not just a rock wall sitting there, but it actually blends in well, or maybe has functionality of, say, if there's like cliffside erosion, you have seawall, it turns into a path, like you have in Myring Bay and Milford and stuff. So any sort of considerations?
So in terms of, sorry, I missed the first word you said, but I think you're talking about beneficial use or making if you're doing something, what is the additional value add that you can add for that particular structure? That's something I guess that is always thought through, I guess bang for buck. At the moment, the level of detail we're going through now at this particular stage is quite high level. Through the CRG, they'll be, I guess, diving down into a little bit more detail, but still quite high level. What you're talking about more is when there's agreement to do a specific action, a hold the line or an intervention action, and that design process would then start looking at those benefits. But that's a little bit down the track.
But again, coming back to the community values that I've been banging on about, that's what we need to hear, because that, if, for example, there was somewhere where we were doing hold the line, but there was also a really strong push from the community that everyone loved walking along, lengthwise along that beach, but for whatever reason, the only option we could do was a hard hold the line, which would mean we'd lose some of that beach over time. It would really clearly be then identifiable outcome to have walking access along that walk. So again, it's another really good example of why I'm really pushing these values, because they do actually inform what the technical guys are able to fit into the design. They make sure we identify the right things. So even just saying I like to walk north-south along the beach, and if enough people say that, when we get to that level of detail, we have a really strong case to say, whatever you do, it must include access for the public from the north to the south along this beach. I can't overstate how important that is for this process.
Yeah. Often it feels like in Whangaparāoa, we always get missed out. We're always the ones that get... I know that you do invest, but compared to the rest of Auckland, it always feels like we get next to nothing.
Everywhere I go, they say the same thing.
I think maybe just to add to that as well, Richard's point there around when we get into the sort of granular detail of whether we select a retreat or whether we select a seawall, we make every effort to balance all the values that Jeff's been talking about in the design. So for Orewa, for example, the recently granted seawall for Orewa Beach, it wasn't simply a seawall, it was a seawall which integrated a path, planting, access to the beach. The seawall itself was treated with a masonry finish for a better aesthetic look and feel. And in combination with the seawall, we also agreed to replenish the beach to keep more sand, more dry high tide sand in front of that seawall over a longer period as well, to improve the aesthetic, to improve amenity and the access. So, but that is really at the end of the scale, the granular level of detail. We're still at a very high level of these discussions. Any other questions? Any other comments from the panel? No? Okay. So all that's left to do is to thank you again for your time. We really appreciate it, and we really appreciate the thought that's gone into the questions. It is being recorded tonight, so your comments are on record. Gives us a chance to go back and reflect on those. Just a reminder for those in the room as well, and those online, the open day on Saturday, 10 to 2 at the Whangaparāoa Library. It'd be great to see more of you there. Bring along your friends, bring along your family, and let's have more of this sort of focused discussion. We're going to have some of the plans that we had up on the wall at presentation 2 in the library as well, so it's going to enable a little bit more focused discussion. And I think, Tracy, we might have ability for people to access social pinpoint via tablets in the library as well. So if you haven't had a chance to access social pinpoint and sort of record your values, the things that we discussed tonight, you'll be able to pick up a device there, do it on the spot. So thank you again. Thank you for your time, and see you